Everybody, good evening. My name is Cynthia Alverez, and this is the Grand Boulevard Coalition Show. I will be your host today, and just as a reminder, I am a case manager for Healthy Living, our number one goal, which is a program that I work for. And I come here to support Grand Boulevard Coalition, just talk about things that are important to our communities today. Things that our communities are currently going through. We're just kind of promoting awareness about specific topics that people might not be too educated on. And so, specifically for today's show, we're going to be doing a talk on self-injury awareness because earlier this month was actually Self-Injury Awareness and Prevention Day on the 1st of March. So I just wanted to do a little talk about that, give some information. It might be a little uncomfortable to talk about and discuss about, but it's important to share just because we need to be aware of people who might be self-harming and things we can do to help them. But before we get into that topic, I want to share a quick flyer for an event that my program will be at, which is the Prom Expo, and it is hosted by a different organization, but we're going to be there to support, and they're going to be giving away free dresses to students going to prom, high schoolers. So if you want to come, they have an address, they have a date and time. We will also be sharing this on our social medias. They'll be teaching you how you can style your prom dresses, accessories to add, how to do your hair care tips, strut walks. We went to this event last year, so I'm sure they're going to be doing very similar things that they did that time. And basically what my program did last time and what we did with Chicago Area Project was with the support of Mariah, one of the people that was working with Chicago Area Project. We did a talk on Narcan. We showed people and students how to use Narcan, what it's used for, how to administer Narcan, and it was a very educational experience for the students. So we hope to do that again, and we will be doing that again this year, and it'll be April 12th. So if you're interested in those details, look at our social medias, Chicago Area Project social media, and getting into the topic for today, like I said, it's going to be on self-injury and self-harm awareness and prevention. Like I said, this is an important topic to talk about, but just be aware we're going to be talking about things relating to self-harm, so just be aware of your discretion if it makes you a little bit uncomfortable. It's important to talk about and spread the information. So kind of getting a little bit into self-injury, what does that mean, and how is it defined? So according to SAMHSA, self-harm refers to when a person hurts their own body purposefully. Someone who self-harms does not mean to kill themselves, so it's not with their intention to end their lives. It is just the intention of strictly harming themselves. And we'll kind of get into the reasons of why people self-harm and things that go into that. So even though they don't intend to end their lives, they are at higher risk of suicide. So it's important to think about that if they do not receive the help that they need. So for them, this is a harmful, it is a harmful way for people to cope, unhealthy coping mechanism, particularly for younger people, most likely found in teenagers, adolescents, and even young adults, people, college age students around those ages. So thinking about that, even in my personal life, when I was in high school, we knew about students who were self-harming and things like that. And I feel like it wasn't something that was talked about enough. And just really, being a teenager, being that age, not understanding why kids, did what they did. It's hard to talk about with your friends if you don't know what to say to your friends or loved ones. It doesn't have to be a friend. Maybe it's someone you know in your family, things like that. You want to kind of have that discussion with them, but you don't know how to go about it, right? And so, this is something that more young people experience, but adults experience this too. It is about, I think one of the percentages I saw was 5% of adults had self-reported on self-harming and self-injury. And so it does happen, between those ages most likely, but also for adults. And then, so this can happen as an unhealthy coping mechanism. It can be because students or young people, adolescents are dealing with stress, feelings of loneliness, feelings of worthlessness, depression, or other mental illnesses like those. It can kind of be related, right? Because kind of like we talk about here, addictions and mental health and unhealthy coping behaviors, it kind of all is connected with each other, and things can get worse if people don't get the help that they need. So that is one of the unhealthy ways that people use to cope with those stressful and hard feelings, right? And so, thinking a little bit more about some statistics, an article from the American Psychosocial Association says that about 17% of youth had engaged in self harm at least once, according to one of their meta analysis of 52 different studies. So, kind of looking at all of those different studies, they got that data, kind of showing that 17% of adolescents had reported to self harming. And even though it sounds like a low number, you have to think about the possibility of students who don't report, right? Who are maybe a part of this study but didn't want to report it, because they'll go to different schools, different colleges, and try to figure out the statistics that way. But some, people might not tell the truth. They might not want to talk about it because it's something that they don't want to share with others, right? So 17%, and that's still, a big number too. And also kind of how I mentioned about college-age students, they said that about a third of the students reported self-injury in 2 college studies. They said that they had hurt themselves so badly that they should have been seen by a medical professional, but only 5% sought treatment. So this is more college-age students as well. So thinking about the risk factors, why college-age students more often maybe versus adolescents. It could be because of a range of different factors. It could be students who have had mental health issues from when they were younger and they never got help for that. So as they got older, they kind of stayed consistent in their unhealthy coping habits. So those things can happen. They might feel isolated at the colleges that they're at, especially if they're a minority and they go to a school that's majority white or Caucasian. They might feel isolated. They might feel alone there and no way to kind of make friends. So they kind of further isolate themselves in those negative feelings, don't have anybody to talk to. Especially if they move out of state for college, that could also be another risk factor because they're far away from home, far from their family and loved ones, so that can further isolate somebody. But yeah, so those are just some of the reasons. Obviously, those are not the only reasons. There can be other things going on as well. And we'll kind of get a little bit into that as well. And according to the Trevor Project, which I brought up before, they're a organization that focuses heavily on LGBTQ students and youth in general. So they do a lot of, asking them about their mental health, self-harm, suicide rates among this community. And so the Trevor Project reports that self-injury was highest among LGBTQ young people ages 13 to 17. And with Native and Indigenous LGBTQ youth being the most affected. And I believe it was followed by multiracial and Hispanic and Latinx populations within the LGBTQ community. So these are all minority, communities, right? So they each go through their own individual, they all have their each individual cultures, especially being multiracial, you have 2 different cultures, 2 different backgrounds, and it can kind of cause a little bit of an identity crisis, maybe with younger kids who are struggling to figure out who they are, especially if they are in the LGBTQ community. It's further, worsening maybe an identity crisis, trying to figure out who they are, feeling like they don't fit into any of these categories that they feel like they have to fit into. So that can further isolate them and make them feel worthless. That's a lot of the feelings that kind of come up with people who self-harm too, feeling of loneliness, worthlessness, anxiety, depression, and especially in this community, right, where resources for these communities are not as prevalent as for other people. So they don't have as many people who understand what they're going through. They might feel like they can't talk to anybody because they won't get it. And especially with the administration these days, being very unaccepting of the LGBTQ community, stating that there are only two genders. And this can, really further confuse younger people too, right, who identify as part of this community. So yeah, that is something to think about. So the ages that we discussed were between 13 to 17 years old. So it is a lot of very young adolescents, right? And of this same population, 88% of them said that they do it to cope with uncomfortable feelings. So they don't have or know about any healthy coping skills that they can use to kind of cope with those negative feelings, right? If they're feeling depressed or anxious, they don't know what to do with those feelings. They don't know who to talk to. So they kind of use self-harm or self-injury as an outlet for those feelings. They kind of describe it as, or just from other articles I read, they say it's like a sense of release of those pent-up feelings. They feel that it helps them. And obviously it does more harm than help, but they don't, realize that in the moment. And then 86% of them say they also do it to deal with frustration, right? So those negative feelings, again, anger, frustration, it can really be a mix of all of those, not just necessarily sadness, but a mix of those feelings, anger. Like I said, if they feel frustrated, right, that there's no help for them, there's maybe, if they're young, if they're in high school, there's nobody they can talk to. Maybe their counselors are overworked and they don't even have enough time to see all their students that need help. They feel like they might be neglected at home, and that they're not being seen, right? So those can cause feelings of frustration, and sadness, anxiety, depression, and things like that. And 76% of them also said that they do it as self-punishment. So this can kind of go a little bit into those feelings of worthlessness, maybe feelings of guilt for who they are, maybe, because a lot of people, with the discussion of LGBTQ communities, there's a lot of people that say it's a choice, but it's not a choice. And, these kids really kind of turn that anger in towards themselves of thinking, why am I like this? Why was I born this way? So it kind of makes them feel that they need to punish themselves, right? So, and that's 76%. That's a big percentage of those youth that feel that way, that feel that they have to hurt themselves because maybe they feel that they're making things difficult for their families' lives, for their loved ones' lives, and they feel responsible somehow, even though it's not their fault. It's just there's a lack of knowledge and a lack of resources in their communities that prevent more people from being more accepting and offering the help that they need, right, to cope with these feelings. And so thinking about forms of self-injury, just kind of getting a little bit into some specifics. So according to Mental Health America, the most common methods of self-injury are skin cutting, headbanging or hitting, and burning. So those are the most common ones. I believe for self-cutting, they reported 70 to 90% of people who self-harm go to that as their go-to for self-injury. And so that's a really high percentage, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about warning signs, right? If you feel like somebody might be self-harming, what are the signs? How can I help them? We'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit. And so thinking more about risk factors, right? So some of the risk factors can be things like even having friends who self-injure, right? That can kind of foster or feed into the idea that it's more acceptable to do something like this because their friends are doing it. And also, like I said, because they don't know how else to cope with their feelings, they have, people kind of associate with friend groups in high school who relate to them the most, right? So there are kids who like anime more, kind of join together, become friends, maybe kids who like soccer, hang out more together, and that kind of goes along with even kids who struggle mentally. They might kind of go with other people who understand them, right, and are struggling with the same things that they're struggling with. So if they have a friend who also doesn't know how to cope healthily, cope in a healthy way with those feelings, they might see that their friend is doing that and think, oh, I'm also struggling with the same thing, and maybe this will help me feel better too, right? And so that is something that can happen. And it kind of encourages those behaviors, right? Because your friends will think it's acceptable as well if you're doing it. Also, trauma or life struggles, it can be abuse, bullying, problems at home, mental health. So all those things come together, especially with trauma, something that maybe they experienced when they were really young, or even something that's still ongoing, like abuse in the home or things like that, domestic abuse, child abuse, or neglect. That's ongoing, that they don't know who to reach out to for help, so they kind of have to find their own way to cope because maybe their parents can't even find the time to work with their child and talk with them about what's going on at school or what's going on in their own life. So they kind of feel more isolated even in the home. And so that can cause, people to find unhealthy coping mechanisms. So yeah, that's another thing. And then lack of resources for mental health, like I discussed. Even in their neighborhood, right? Maybe they don't have places that they know that they can go to relieve stress, like maybe like a YMCA, or places they can meet up with their friends to hang out. And even just mental health resources, right? In their communities, they probably don't have it, or their families can't afford it for them, or don't even have the time to take their child to these things after school. So then they end up not doing those things. And even like I said, even if there is a counselor at the school, the counselor might just not have enough time, or they might be overworked. And so even if they do get time with the counselor, they might feel like it's not as helpful, versus having a dedicated therapist who can take the time out of the day, like an hour out of the day, to work with them. And yeah, so it's a mix of a lot of those things. It doesn't have to be just one. And then other things like alcohol or substance abuse, that can also contribute to someone's likeliness to self-harm. Just because if they're already struggling mentally and then they're drinking or they're using any other kind of substance, it kind of furthers their mental health further downhill. And that can kind of cause them to go into inflicting and self-harm onto themselves, right? As another way to cope in an unhealthy way. So some of the warning signs for some of these things are things that it's hard to notice sometimes, right? You might not notice it right away. And sometimes they hide it really well too, right? So it's not your fault, and don't blame yourself if you feel like, oh, I didn't catch it. I should have caught it. I should have seen it, whether it was your friend or your brother or your a loved one. It's not your fault. So like I said, they're good at hiding it. They don't want other people to know because it's something that they might be ashamed of, and they don't want to talk about it with other people. It makes them uncomfortable. So some of the warning signs include scarring, maybe on their arms, maybe on their legs, on their stomach. It can be from cuts or wounds or bruises. Unexplained frequent injuries. So if they maybe have bruises or burns somewhere, they could say, oh, my cat scratched me, really bad. Or, oh, I touched the pan on my arm and, on accident. But if it looks like multiple burns, then that might be a sign that those were not accidents, right? So it could, like I said, cuts and burns. Some other things maybe that you notice with them could be them having low self-esteem, so talking negatively about themselves, talking about maybe how they don't like themselves, how they hate themselves, using negative language towards themselves could show signs of low self-esteem. Even difficulty handling strong feelings too. So people who get maybe angry very easily, who have a lot of outbursts regularly, Even if they do have like one outburst too, it's important to check in on that person because you don't know if they had another outburst somewhere else in front of other people. So noticing it, if it's a trend or not, you still, address it with them, and check in with them and make sure, ask what that outburst, why they had an outburst, what happened, kind of talk through those feelings. But just noticing that those things kind of happen too, right, is also important. Sharing feelings of worthlessness, hopelessness, can be some signs too. So maybe saying things like they don't, see a future for themselves, that they, wish that they weren't alive, that they wish. It doesn't even have to be things like that because that can be more onto like suicidal territory, but just kind of saying very, negative things towards themselves or about, what's going on in the world, just always talking negatively. That can also be another sign. If you have, or if you notice somebody who has long sleeves and pants on during the summertime specifically, right? Because wearing long sleeve and pants, I mean, that's normal. Everybody's wearing that. But if it's during the summer and you notice they're doing it constantly, like every day you see them, they have long sleeve, they have a sweater, and it's hot outside, and pants on, they might be trying to cover something up or hide something. So it's important to kind of think more about why. And then, yeah, so those are a lot of the warning signs. So kind of thinking about all of those together, obviously, not just one of those things like the low self-esteem is a sign that they're self-harming, but kind of thinking of all of those things together. And so with prevention, what can you do to help? Just, like I said, once you see these warning signs, you think that they need help, that's your time to step in, check in on your friends, say, I noticed that you're wearing long sleeves in the summer, something going on at home. Are you okay? Are you taking care of yourself? Word it however you feel fits the situation, the relationship for you and that person. I noticed that you might be self-harming. Do you want to talk about it? Do you want to talk to somebody else if you don't want to talk to me? Just encouraging them to talk about it, whether it's with you or somebody else. And don't, take it personally if they don't want to talk about it with you, but just always encouraging that. And then encourage supportive social networks and discourage unhealthy ones, right? So encouraging them to make friends with or go to groups where they talk in groups with other people who might be going through what they're going through. Talking with more people who are not self-harming so that way it doesn't further be acceptable, the self-harming behaviors and things like it doesn't normalize it, right? And things like that. Even avoiding places like Reddit is a social media forum that has been known to, I think they've been better about it these days, but it has been known to have subreddit communities within that website that encourage self-harm, that kind of people feed off of each other's negative feelings and negative behaviors. So making sure that your child or that your friend is avoiding these kinds of things online, and just, raise awareness about this, talk about it with other people, and share the importance of kids being on social media all the time because that can be a big factor too. Kids will compare themselves, whether it's physically or in other ways, financially to other kids their age who might be making a lot of money or who may look better and, objectively, subjectively, I forgot what the right word is, but just comparing themselves physically to other kids and how that affects their self-esteem, right? And their mental health, all the things they see online, that can be negativity, also things going on in their community, violence, things like that can just make them feel less secure in their homes or things like feel less safe and things like that. So raising awareness about that is very important. Make sure you check in with your people, your family, constantly. Make sure that everyone's okay. Check in with yourself as well and make sure that you're okay. But yeah, that will be all for this talk. I hope that you all learned something from it today. I appreciate you all taking the time, as you always do, to watch my show, and I hope that you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.